April 7, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The fuel line detached from the Grumman F-4F Wildcat with a sharp metallic click as Second Lieutenant James Elm Sweat settled into his cockpit, unaware that the next 15 minutes would elevate him from an ordinary mechanic's son into an American legend. His hands, still rough from years of laboring with marine turbines in his father's San Francisco workshop, gripped the control column with remarkable steadiness for someone about to face his first combat sortie. The radio suddenly crackled to life, carrying words that changed everything. Condition red. Condition very red. A wave of 150 Japanese aircraft was approaching from the north. Every pilot on Guadalcanal understood what that meant. The largest enemy air raid since Pearl Harbor was only minutes away. Between those bombers and the American fleet stood 76 Allied fighters clawing desperately for altitude. Among them was a 22-year-old former factory worker who had never fired his guns in anger, never seen an enemy plane except in training reels, never experienced the chaos of an actual dogfight. What none of the Japanese aviators knew as they advanced in their meticulously coordinated formations was that they were about to confront a fusion of instinct, precision, and raw talent that would produce one of the most extraordinary aerial performances in wartime history. James Elm Sweat was born on June 15, 1920, in Seattle, Washington, the eldest of 3 children born to George Elm Sweat and Nellie Emily Burns Sweat. His father, George, was an electrical engineer and Marine Corps reservist who established a small company manufacturing marine pumps and turbines. When James was young, the family relocated to San Mateo, California, where George expanded his operations in the San Francisco Bay Area. The firm specialized in maritime industrial hardware, the unglamorous yet indispensable machinery that kept ships operational and ports functioning. Young James grew up surrounded by the practical world of mechanics, gears, valves, and horsepower calculations. He attended San Mateo High School, where nothing hinted at his future heroism. After graduating in 1939, he enrolled at the College of San Mateo, a modest junior college that represented the educational horizon for most working-class families. College life brought James an unexpected opportunity. As war loomed, the federal government launched the civilian pilot training program to build a reserve of potential aviators. The initiative subsidized flight instruction for college students, and James seized it eagerly. Flying came naturally. The same mechanical insight that let him understand turbine systems transferred effortlessly to aircraft controls. He soloed quickly, advanced steadily, and by the program's end had logged 450 hours of flight time, a number that would later prove vital. Most naval cadets received far fewer hours in training. When James entered military flight school, he possessed more experience than some of his instructors. As global tensions worsened through 1940 and early 1941, Europe burning under Nazi expansion and Japan pressing deeper into Asia, James enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve on August 26, 1941, beginning flight school that September. At Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas, his natural skill and discipline quickly set him apart. He graduated in early 1942 within the top 10% of his class, earning a choice few were offered: accept a Navy commission or transfer to the Marine Corps. James chose the Marines. On April 1, 1942, exactly 1 year before his legendary mission, Second Lieutenant Sweat received his gold wings and commission as a naval aviator. Standing 5 feet 11 inches, weighing 154 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes, he looked ordinary. Nothing in his appearance hinted at the warrior he would become. Advanced instruction followed at Quantico, Virginia, then carrier qualification aboard the USS Wolverine on Lake Michigan, and finally tactical training in San Diego, California. The Marines were forging aviators for the brutal air battles of the Pacific. Training emphasized survival as much as success. Stay fast. Dive away. Never turn with a zero. Rely on your wingman. Conserve ammunition. Aim true. These lessons were drilled by veterans who had survived the early catastrophes at Pearl Harbor and Wake Island. They knew what kept a pilot alive. By March 1943, Second Lieutenant Sweat shipped out aboard the escort carrier USS Nassau bound for the Southwest Pacific. The voyage took weeks, first to Hawaii for advanced tactics, then onward to the combat zone. Seasoned flyers spoke of endless Japanese raids, of 4 mission days, of squadrons wiped out in mere weeks. When VMF, 221 finally arrived at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides later that March. The Marines received their final briefing before deployment. Sweat was assigned to Marine Fighting Squadron 221, VMF 221, part of Marine Air Group 21, 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, and soon he would write his name into aviation history. The squadron had earned its reputation defending Wake Island in December 1941, where 4 Wildcats and their pilots had fought heroically against overwhelming Japanese forces. Now reconstituted with new pilots and aircraft, VMF 221 flew from Espiritu Santo to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to join the ongoing air campaign. Henderson Field represented American determination. Built initially by Japanese construction crews in July 1942, it had been captured by the 1st Marine Division on August 7th and defended against relentless Japanese attacks for 8 months. The airfield remained crude by any standard. A single runway of pierced steel planking, revetments constructed from sandbags and palm logs, tents for maintenance facilities. Rain turned the area into a swamp. Heat and humidity were oppressive. Malaria was endemic. Yet Henderson Field was arguably the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific War. Allied aircraft operating from Henderson commanded the waters around Guadalcanal and prevented Japanese reinforcement. Control of Henderson meant control of the Solomon Islands. Control of the Solomons meant securing the supply line to Australia. Everything depended on that single muddy runway and the men who flew from it. James Sweat spent his first weeks on Guadalcanal learning combat operations without actually engaging the enemy. VMF 221 flew patrols constantly, but Sweat's division never made contact. He flew routine missions, gained familiarity with his aircraft, developed chemistry with his fellow pilots, and waited. The waiting ended in early April 1943 when Allied intelligence detected ominous Japanese preparations. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed massive concentrations of enemy planes at Rabaul, Bougainville, Kahili, and Balali. Japanese radio traffic increased dramatically. What the Americans were detecting was Operation Wigo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's aerial counteroffensive designed to halt Allied advances. Yamamoto had gathered nearly 350 aircraft for the operation, stripping fighters and dive bombers from 4 aircraft carriers to supplement land-based air forces. The first major attack was scheduled for April 7, 1943, targeting ships and aircraft at Guadalcanal. Yamamoto committed 67 ID-3A dive bombers code named Val by the Allies, escorted by 110 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. The formation totaled 177 aircraft launched from bases over 400 m to the northwest. The raid was organized into 6 elements. 2 fighter sweeps would arrive first. Then 4 waves of dive bombers would attack in carefully timed sequence. Japanese commanders anticipated significant success. American intelligence had detected the buildup but could not predict exact timing. Coast watchers, brave Australian and New Zealand observers hidden on Japanese-controlled islands provided early warning. On the morning of April 7th, reconnaissance aircraft detected activity suggesting an imminent raid. At 12:26 p.m., Coast Watcher reports of the approaching formation reached Guadalcanal. By 2:00 p.m., with the raid imminent, Henderson Field broadcast. Condition read. Every available fighter was prepared for launch. At noon 2nd, Lieutenant James Sweat led his division of 4 Grumman F-4 Wildcats on a routine combat air patrol over the Russell Islands, 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The patrol proved uneventful. After 2 hours aloft with fuel running low and no enemy contact, Sweat led his division back to Henderson Field. They landed at approximately 2 p.m. and taxied to the revetments. Ground crews immediately began hand-pumping aviation fuel into the Wildcats tanks. Each aircraft required 117 gallons. The process would take at least 30 minutes. Sweat climbed down from his cockpit, stretched his cramped legs, and prepared to wait. Then everything changed. The operations officer made an instant decision. Launch everything. Partially fueled aircraft were better than aircraft caught on the ground. Sweat was still standing beside his Wildcat, Bureau number 12084, when the alert sounded. Ground crews shouted at him to mount up. The fuel hose was yanked from his wing tank, spilling precious gasoline on the pierced steel planking. Around him, 76 Allied fighters were scrambling for altitude. 36 F-4F Wildcats from Marine squadrons, 9 F-4U Corsairs, 6 P-40 Warhawks, 12 P-38 Lightnings, and 13 P-39 Era Cabras. Every fighter within range was being thrown into the air to face the approaching Japanese armada. The Wildcat that Sweat flew represented America's first-generation carrier fighter, already obsolescent but still deadly in capable hands. The F-4F-4 variant carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, with 240 rounds per gun. Total ammunition load was 1,440 rounds, translating to approximately 18 to 20 seconds of sustained fire. The Wildcats' limitations were well known. Maximum speed of 318 miles per hour at 19,000 feet, climb rate of approximately 1,900 feet per minute under ideal conditions. Though combat-loaded, aircraft climbed slower, turn radius inferior to Japanese fighters. Range limited to 700 m. The aircraft was slower and less maneuverable than its primary opponent in almost every performance category. What the Wildcat possessed was durability and firepower. The airframe could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying. The .50 caliber machine guns hit far harder than lighter weapons carried by Japanese fighters. American pilots had learned to use these advantages through tactics emphasizing diving attacks, mutual support, and disengagement rather than sustained turning dogfights. Sweat advanced his throttle and felt the Pratt & Whitney R1830-86 twin Wasp engine roar to full power. 1,200 horsepower drove the 3-bladed propeller, pulling the Wildcat forward. The fighter accelerated slowly, heavily loaded with fuel and ammunition. It required every foot of the short runway to gain flying speed. At 70 miles per hour, Sweat pulled back on the stick and the Wildcat lifted reluctantly into the air. He raised his landing gear by hand, cranking the retraction handle 30 times to fold the wheels into their wing recesses. The process required his right hand off the throttle for nearly 30 seconds while his left hand flew the aircraft. It was an exhausting procedure during the critical moment after takeoff, but every Wildcat pilot had done it hundreds of times. Once airborne, Sweat joined with his 3 wing men and began the desperate climb for altitude. Japanese dive bombers would approach at 15 to 20,000 feet. American fighters needed to reach that altitude or higher. The Wildcat climbed slowly, painfully slowly, for pilots who knew the enemy was approaching at 300 miles per hour. At approximately 1,800 feet per minute in combat conditions, reaching 15,000 feet required nearly 9 minutes. Around Sweat, the sky filled with climbing American fighters, all clawing for altitude, all racing against time. Below him, Sweat could see the waters north of Guadalcanal. Tulagi Harbor contained American ships, 3 cruisers, several destroyers, cargo vessels, tankers, and auxiliaries. Thousands of American sailors, unaware that 177 Japanese aircraft were approaching to destroy them. The radio net crackled with reports. Coast watchers tracking the raid. Fighter directors coordinating the intercept. Pilots reporting positions and altitudes. The controlled chaos of aerial warfare in 1943 before sophisticated radar, before modern command and control, when everything depended on visual sighting and voice. Radio. At approximately 2:15 p.m. at 14,000-foot altitude over the Russell Islands, Sweat spotted them. Dark specks against the blue sky to the northwest, growing rapidly larger. dozens of aircraft in tight formation, more than Sweat had ever seen, more than he had imagined possible. The entire Japanese raid stretching across miles of sky organized into precise elements, approaching with terrifying determination. Sweat keyed his radio microphone. Tallahassee bandits 12 o'clock high. Multiple bogeys. His voice was steady, showing none of the fear that clenched his stomach. Fighter director acknowledged. All fighters engage. Good hunting. That was it. No elaborate tactics. No careful coordination, just engage. 76 American fighters against 177 Japanese aircraft. Sweat rolled his Wildcat into a steep diving turn, positioning for an attack on the dive bombers. His wingmen followed, maintaining formation discipline despite the chaos erupting around them. Below and ahead, he could see the Aish-3A Val dive bombers in neat formations. The Vals were single-engine aircraft each, carrying a crew of 2 and 1,000 pounds bomb. They were obsolescent, slow, and vulnerable but deadly if they reached their targets. Sweat selected 3 valves that had separated slightly from the main formation. He positioned his division above and behind them, setting up for a classic overhead diving attack. The Japanese rear gunners would see him coming but would have difficulty tracking a target diving at high speed. At 350 miles per hour, Sweat pulled out of his dive, directly behind the trailing Val. The Japanese aircraft filled his gun sight, growing from a small silhouette to a clearly defined target in seconds. Range: close to 200 yards, 150 Y, 100 Y. Sweat pressed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. The sound was deafening even through his leather helmet. The Wildcat shuddered from recoil. Tracers reached out toward the Val. The first burst struck the Val's fuselage and left wing. Pieces of metal tore away from the Japanese bomber. The rear gunner stopped firing. The Val began smoking, then burning, then exploded in midair. First kill. Sweat had no time to think, no time to celebrate. He was already lining up the second Val, which was desperately trying to evade. The Japanese pilot dove toward the water. Sweat followed, keeping his Wildcat positioned behind and slightly above, firing short, precise bursts. The second Val caught fire and went down. 2 kills in less than 30 seconds. Sweat pulled up hard, looking for the third Val. The Japanese pilot had seen his companions destroyed and was attempting to escape. Sweat climbed after him, using energy from his dive to maintain pursuit. The Val was slow, barely 200 miles per hour in level flight. The Wildcat closed steadily. At 100 yards, Sweat fired a long burst. The Val exploded, raining debris into the ocean below. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed in his first 90 seconds of combat. 3 bombers that would never reach American ships. But Sweat had become separated from his division during the attack. His wingmen had engaged different targets and were now scattered across the sky. He found himself alone in the middle of the largest air battle in the Pacific War to date. As Sweat climbed back toward the main engagement, American anti-aircraft fire from the ships below opened up on everything in the sky. The gunners could not distinguish between American and Japanese aircraft at altitude. They fired at everything that moved, filling the air with exploding shells and shrapnel. A burst of anti-aircraft fire detonated near Sweat's left wing. Shrapnel punctured the wing surface and damaged the aileron. The Wildcat suddenly became harder to control, requiring constant pressure on the stick to maintain level flight. A less experienced pilot might have disengaged. Sweat checked his instruments. Oil pressure steady, engine temperature normal, flight controls still responding despite the wing damage. He was still combat capable. The decision took seconds. He would continue fighting. Ahead and below, Sweat spotted a formation of 6 more valves approaching Taiji Harbor for their attack run. These Bombers were flying in loose line of stern formation, following each other toward the target. They had been separated from their fighter escort by the ferocious American interception and now flew unprotected. Sweat dove on them. The Japanese pilots never saw him coming. Diving from above, and behind with the sun at his back, Sweat approached the last bomber in the line. He closed to less than 100 yards. Before opening fire, the valve exploded instantly, its bomb detonating from the gunfire. Sweat flew through the debris cloud, his windscreen temporarily obscured by smoke and fragments. He pulled up slightly, acquired the next target, fired another burst. The second valve burst into flames and fell away. Sweat worked his way up the line methodically, firing short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, making every bullet count. Each valve he destroyed was one less bomb falling on American ships. The fourth valve took more hits to destroy. Sweat's ammunition was running low, and his bursts were shorter. He closed to less than 50 yards. Close enough to see the Japanese rear gunner firing desperately at him. Close enough to see the terrified face of the pilot. Sweat fired until the valve caught fire and fell toward the ocean. 4 more kills, bringing his total to 7 enemy aircraft destroyed. Sweat was now officially an ace, having achieved 5 or more aerial victories in a single combat lasting approximately 15 minutes. It was an almost unprecedented achievement, but Sweat was not finished. Ahead, he spotted one more valve attempting to reach the ships. The Japanese pilot was flying at wave-top altitude. Sweat dove after him, his damaged Wildcat responding sluggishly to control inputs. He closed on the valve from behind and above, lined up the shot, and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. His guns were dry. All 1,440 rounds of ammunition had been expended during roughly 15 minutes of combat. Now, he faced an enemy bomber with nothing left to fire. Most aviators would have disengaged at this stage. Without ammunition, a fighter was defenseless. The sensible decision was to head back to base, rearm, and rejoin the engagement. But James Sweat made another choice. He pressed on with his attack against the valve despite having no rounds remaining, diving directly at the Japanese bomber in an attempt to rattle its pilot into breaking off. The valve's rear gunner, however, was not shaken. He unleashed burst after burst at the oncoming Wildcat. Bullets tore through Sweat's aircraft. The windscreen shattered under repeated hits, shards of glass slicing across his cheek and forehead. Blood streamed into his eyes, half blinding him. His engine began coughing as enemy rounds struck vital systems. Oil pressure dropped. Temperature spiked. The oil cooler had been punctured, crippled by the valve's defensive fire. The Pratt & Whitney engine that had performed flawlessly all mission was dying. Sweat pulled away and turned toward Henderson Field, praying he could make it back before the engine seized. The Wildcat jolted and lurched as the cylinders misfired. Thick black smoke poured from the cowling. Oil coated the windscreen, worsening visibility already blurred by blood and cracked glass. He was 15 miles from Henderson Field, flying a crippled aircraft, bleeding from facial wounds, the engine moments from total failure. Below him lay Tulagi Harbor and Florida Island. If the engine quit, he would have to ditch in the sea. Near the harbor, rescue might come quickly. Farther out meant almost certain death. The engine decided for him. With a metallic scream, the Pratt & Whitney seized. The propeller froze. The Wildcat became a glider. Sweat had maybe 2 minutes of airtime left. He trimmed for best glide speed, around 110 miles per hour, and scanned for a calm stretch of water. The surface near Florida Island looked smooth enough. If he could pull off a clean ditching, if the Wildcat didn't flip or break apart, he might survive. In the final moments before impact, he followed procedure to perfection. Landing gear lowered manually to act as a drag brake. Canopy open for quick escape. Shoulder straps cinched tight to prevent being hurled forward. He guided the aircraft toward the water at the ideal attitude. Too steep, it would nose under. Too flat, it would skip and tumble. 5 degrees nose up was the sweet spot. At 50 feet, He eased back on the stick, bleeding off speed. 40 feet, 30, 20, 10. The Wildcat's tail kissed the water first, exactly as intended. The plane decelerated brutally, throwing Sweat forward against the straps. His face slammed into the instrument panel, breaking his nose with a sharp crack. Agonizing pain shot through his skull. The Wildcat settled in the water and immediately began to sink, its heavy engine pulling the nose down. Seawater rushed in through the open canopy. Sweat had seconds to escape before being dragged under. He fumbled for his harness buckle with fingers slick with blood. It popped free. He tried to push up, but his parachute rig snagged on something. Trapped. The water rose fast, up to his chest, icy salt stinging his wounds. He yanked again and again, panic building. The harness stayed caught. The Wildcat sank faster. Water reached his chin, his mouth, his nose. He was underwater, still trapped, drowning in 10 feet of sea after surviving a quarter-hour of deadly combat. His lungs screamed. His vision dimmed. With one final desperate pull, the harness tore loose. He forced himself upward, swimming toward the surface he could no longer see. His life vest should have inflated automatically, but didn't. Maybe damaged by shrapnel, maybe tangled in the harness. His strength failed. His chest burned. Then, suddenly, the vest inflated. The CO2 cartridge finally triggered. Buoyancy shot him upward. He burst through the surface, gasping, choking, dragging in lungfuls of air. Blood and seawater streamed down his face. His broken nose throbbed. His chest ached from the impact, but he was alive. Overhead, the battle raged on. Planes diving and climbing, guns hammering, bombs detonating, ships firing in endless flak bursts. 15 minutes later, a Coast Guard rescue boat spotted him bobbing in the water. The crew hauled him aboard, gave him morphine, patched his wounds with field dressings. Someone passed him a bottle of whiskey. He drank gratefully, the burn warming his stunned body. The boat brought him to Tulagi Harbor, where he was transferred to the naval hospital on Guadalcanal. Doctors cleaned and stitched his cuts, set his broken nose, and checked for internal damage. Miraculously, aside from facial wounds and the nose fracture, Sweat was essentially unhurt. No broken bones beyond the nose, no internal trauma. The morphine dulled the pain enough to rest. Over the next few days of recovery, squadron mates and intelligence officers visited. Multiple witnesses had seen his attacks on the valves. Other pilots confirmed his repeated dives. Shipboard gunners had watched his relentless assault on the enemy bombers. The intelligence report was unequivocal. Second Lieutenant James Elm Sweat had destroyed 7 enemy aircraft on his first combat mission, making him an instant ace, one of the rare ace-in-a-day pilots. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding naval aviation in the South Pacific, personally recommended Sweat for the Medal of Honor, a nomination seldom denied. After recovering, Sweat rejoined VMF 221, now transitioning from F-4F Wildcats to the newer F-4U Corsairs, far superior machines. He checked out in the Corsair during a brief rest in Australia, then returned to the Russell Islands in May to fly again. On June 30, 1943, now promoted to first lieutenant, Sweat provided air cover for the Allied landings at Renova Island. During that mission, he shot down 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty medium bombers and shared credit for destroying a Zero fighter with another pilot. 11 days later, on July 11th near New Georgia Island, Sweat shot down 2 more Bettys while defending his wingmen from attacking Zeros. He then destroyed a Zero pursuing his wingman's Corsair, preventing what would have been a certain kill. But Sweat failed to see a second Zero positioning behind him. The Japanese pilot's cannon fire struck Sweat's Corsair, damaging the engine and fuel system. For the second time in 3 months, James Sweat found himself attempting an emergency landing. This time, there was no Coast Guard boat nearby. He was over open water far from friendly forces with an engine losing power and leaking fuel. He managed to ditch the Corsair, successfully exiting the cockpit without major injury and inflated his life raft. He floated alone in enemy-controlled waters, hoping for rescue before Japanese forces found him. Two local Solomon Islanders in a small canoe spotted Sweat several hours later. They were native islanders who served as scouts for Australian coast watchers. The islanders pulled Sweat into their canoe and paddled him to their village. From there, he was transported by a larger 10-man canoe for several hours to reach an Australian coast watcher station hidden in the jungle. The coast watcher, an Australian serviceman living behind Japanese lines and radioing intelligence to Allied forces, coordinated with Allied Command for Sweat's evacuation. A PBY Catalina flying boat landed in a sheltered bay the next day and retrieved Sweat. He was returned to the Russell Islands exhausted but uninjured. The Coast Watcher Network and local islanders had saved countless Allied lives during the Pacific War. Sweat owed his life to their courage. The islanders received compensation of $14 worth of calico cloth and canned beef. Modest payment that Sweat later said was inadequate recognition for saving his life. In October 1943, Sweat flew missions over Bougainville, engaging Japanese aircraft defending the major airbase at Kahili. He shot down 1-0 confirmed and damaged another probable kill. In November, he added 2 more Valdive bombers to his tally. He also engaged a Kawasaki K-61 Tony fighter, though intelligence officers could only confirm it as probable rather than confirmed destruction. By December 1943, James Sweat had flown 103 combat missions and accumulated 15 confirmed aerial victories. He was 23 years old. On October 10, 1943, while Sweat was still in the combat zone, Major General Ralph Johnson Mitchell, commanding the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, presented First Lieutenant James Elm Sweat with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony held at Espiritu Santo. The citation recognized his extraordinary heroism on April 7, 1943, when he unhesitatingly led his division against a superior force of enemy bombers, personally destroyed 3 aircraft during his initial dive, then boldly attacked 6 additional enemy bombers after being separated from his division, shooting down 4 more despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and returned fire from the bombers that damaged his aircraft, shattered his windscreen, and wounded him before he successfully ditched his fighter in the water of Tulagi. The Marine Corps decided Sweat needed rest. He departed the combat zone on December 11, 1943 and arrived in San Francisco on December 31. He was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station Santa Barbara, California to train new pilots preparing for Pacific deployment. In spring 1944, First Lieutenant Sweat traveled to Washington and met President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the White House during a ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. Roosevelt, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, asked informed questions about the Corsair and combat tactics. Sweat found the President genuinely interested. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, far longer than scheduled, because Roosevelt kept asking follow-up questions about Pacific air combat. By late 1944, Sweat was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California, where VMF 221 was training for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. The squadron was equipped with F-4U-4 Corsairs and assigned to provide close air support for landing forces. Every pilot knew Operation Olympic would be the bloodiest campaign in history. Then in August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15. The war was over. Operation Olympic was cancelled. VMF 221 had ended the war ranked second among all Marine squadrons with 185 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, Sweat commanded Marine Fighting Squadron 141, flying Corsairs at Naval Air Station Alama, California. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, VMF 141 was deployed to Korea. But Sweat was left behind. The Navy had made a policy decision that Medal of Honor recipients were too valuable to risk in combat. Sweat protested vigorously, arguing that he should lead his squadron. The Navy was unmoved. Frustrated, Sweat left active duty around 1950 and continued service in the Marine Corps Reserve. He would eventually retire in 1970 with the rank of colonel, having served 29 years. Sweat returned to San Francisco and went to work in his father's company manufacturing marine pumps and turbines. The business George Elm Sweat had founded in 1920 was still operating, still building the essential machinery that kept maritime industry functioning. James, now Colonel Sweat in the reserves, returned to the machine shop. He had left 12 years earlier. The calluses on his hands, worn smooth during his years of flying, gradually returned as he worked with pumps and valves and turbines. In 1960, George Sweat died and James inherited the company. For the next 23 years, he ran the business his father had built, maintaining the same commitment to quality engineering that had sustained the company through the Depression and war years. He eventually passed the business to his son, continuing the family tradition. The pump company remained modest but profitable, providing steady employment and reliable products. Sweat moved to Trinity Center, California in retirement, later relocating to Reading. He became a frequent speaker at schools where he shared not combat stories, but rather his beliefs about personal values, respect, responsibility, and citizenship. He talked about the importance of doing your job well, supporting your teammates, and maintaining your equipment properly. He rarely discussed killing enemy pilots. When students asked about combat, he emphasized teamwork and training rather than individual heroics. His message focused on duty, preparation, and collective effort. In 2006, the History Channel produced an episode of their series Dog Fights, recreating Sweat's April 7, 1943 mission using computer graphics. Sweat provided commentary for the episode, describing his actions with the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing mechanical engineering. The episode aired on November 24, 2006, and introduced Sweat's story to a new generation. Younger viewers found it difficult to reconcile the elderly man speaking calmly about the mission with the intense computer-generated combat they watched on screen. But that was precisely who James Sweat had been throughout his life. A man who did extraordinary things without considering them extraordinary. On January 18, 2009, Colonel James Elm Sweat died in a Reading hospital from heart failure after a lengthy illness. He was 88 years old. He was survived by his family, his legacy, and the memory of 15 minutes that had transformed an industrial worker into a legend. He was buried with full military honors at Northern California Veterans Cemetery in Igo, California. The funeral was attended by hundreds, including surviving members of VMF 221, fellow Medal of Honor recipients, and representatives from the Marine Corps and Navy. Fighter aircraft performed a missing man formation flyover. A Marine honor guard fired a 21-gun salute. Taps echoed across the cemetery grounds. The American flag that had draped his coffin was folded with military precision and presented to his family. The story of James Elm Sweat illuminates profound truths about heroism and the character of the men who won World War II. Sweat was not a professional warrior descended from military tradition or educated at elite mise. He was a working-class young man from the San Francisco Bay Area who happened to possess natural flying ability and unshakable courage. His story was replicated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater. Farmers became tank commanders. Shopkeepers became bombarders. Factory workers became submariners. America took ordinary citizens and transformed them into a military force that defeated professional armies that had trained for decades. The transformation was systematic and thorough based on principles America understood instinctively. Provide excellent training. Supply the best equipment possible. Trust individuals to make decisions. Reward initiative and aggressive action. These principles, anathema to authoritarian military systems, produced combat effectiveness that totalitarian Regimes could not match. The American military system produced thousands of skilled pilots and soldiers who performed at levels enemy commanders considered impossible. James Sweat shot down 7 Japanese aircraft on his first mission, not because he was superhuman but because he was superbly trained, adequately equipped, and trusted to use his initiative. The decision to press an attack without ammunition was his alone, made in seconds based on training and instinct. This individual initiative, this assumption of personal responsibility without requiring permission characterized American combat effectiveness throughout the war. Technology and training created opportunities for victory, but individual courage remained essential. Comparing production statistics reveals the industrial disparity that shaped the Pacific War's outcome. During World War II, the United States produced approximately 324,000 aircraft of all types. Germany produced approximately 94,000 aircraft total. Japan produced approximately 76,000 combat aircraft. American aircraft production exceeded the combined Axis total substantially, but numbers alone understate American advantages. American aircraft were generally more durable, carried more ammunition, possessed better equipment, and were maintained by better trained ground crews supplied with unlimited spare parts. An F-4F Wildcat destroyed in combat was replaced within days. A Japanese Zero destroyed might not be replaced for months due to production bottlenecks and material shortages. American pilot training similarly emphasized quality over quantity. The United States trained approximately 193,000 pilots during World War II from over 317,000 cadets who entered training. Washout rates remained above 39% even during pilot shortages. The system prioritized quality, understanding that poorly trained pilots died quickly without achieving objectives. Japan was forced to reduce training standards as losses mounted. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with less than 100 hours total flight time, compared to Sweat's 450 hours. Before enlistment, plus extensive military training, Japanese pilots died in their first missions, unable to survive against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. This created a death spiral where Japan's experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained, leading to declining pilot quality, higher losses, and accelerated decline. America continuously produced well-trained, confident pilots flying increasingly superior aircraft backed by unlimited logistics. Yet, even with these advantages, men like James Sweat still had to face enemy fire and risk death. Courage alone was insufficient but remained essential. The America that James Sweat returned to after the war had been transformed by total mobilization. The economy had exploded from depression stagnation to full employment and booming production. New industries had been created virtually overnight. The nation had discovered capabilities it had not known it possessed. This transformation was particularly evident to combat veterans returning from overseas. They had witnessed American military power abroad and now returned to see American economic power at home, creating unprecedented prosperity. The two were connected. The same industrial capacity that built aircraft could build automobiles. The same organizational skills that coordinated military logistics could coordinate domestic supply chains. The same engineering expertise that designed weapons could design consumer products. America was poised to dominate the post-war world through economic productivity. The pump company Sweat operated exemplified this. Small-scale, locally owned, technically sophisticated, reliably profitable. Thousands of such companies across America produced components and equipment that sustained the economy. They were not glamorous, but they were essential. Sweat's decision to return to his father's business reflected his values. He had never sought fame. The Medal of Honor was appreciated, but not defining. What mattered was doing useful work, providing for family, contributing to community. These modest aspirations characterized millions of World War II veterans who returned home and quietly built post-war prosperity. They went back to work, raised families, paid taxes, and participated in civic life without demanding special treatment. The Greatest Generation earned its title not through combat heroism alone, but through the collective decision to build, rather than complain, to contribute rather than demand, to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. Sweat's school speeches emphasized values more than combat. He told students that success came from preparation and hard work, that security came from competence, that respect came from responsibility. He rarely mentioned killing enemy pilots except when directly asked. There was no glorification of violence, no triumphalism, no hatred of former enemies. By the 1980s, American attitudes toward World War II had evolved. The war was increasingly seen as morally unambiguous, clearly justified, successfully concluded. Veterans were honored as heroes, their service appreciated, their sacrifices recognized. This represented significant change from earlier decades when World War II was taken for granted, overshadowed by Korea and Vietnam. Colonel James Sweat's funeral in 2009 brought closure to a life spanning nearly 9 decades, witnessing America's transformation from depression, uncertainty to 21st century superpower status. Sweat was born in 1920 when the United States was still recovering from World War I. He died in 2009 when America was the unquestioned global hegemon. That transformation required the efforts of millions, but men like Sweat had been essential contributors. His 15 minutes of combat on April 7, 1943, represented a tiny fraction of the vast American war effort. Yet, thousands of similar actions collectively overwhelmed Japanese forces. They faced not just skilled pilots but an entire system designed to produce skilled pilots, continuously supply them with excellent aircraft, constantly support them with logistics unfailingly. The system enabled heroism but did not create it. James Sweat's decision to continue attacking without ammunition was individual choice, not systematic programming. His survival of ditching was personal resilience, not organizational design. His decades of post-war service were character traits developed through upbringing, not learned military behaviors. The system provided opportunity. Sweat provided courage and competence. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The story of James Elm Sweat resonates across generations because it embodies values Americans recognize as fundamentally their own: individual initiative rather than blind obedience, personal responsibility rather than dependence on authority, technical competence valued over social status, humble service rather than self-promotion, quiet courage rather than bombast. Sweat represented millions of ordinary Americans who accomplished extraordinary things when circumstances demanded. He insisted he had simply done his job, but in performing that duty exceptionally, he and thousands like him overcame formidable adversaries, safeguarded civilization, and laid the groundwork for generations of peace and prosperity. The America Sweat defended in 1943 was far from perfect, burdened by domestic issues such as racial segregation and economic disparity. Yet it also embodied hope for oppressed nations, offered paths for advancement based on merit rather than heritage, and blended individual freedom with shared purpose more effectively than earlier societies. The fact that a working man could rise to become a fighter ace, receive the nation's highest military honor, and then return home to manage his father's business without ceremony demonstrated the egalitarian spirit that distinguished America from rigidly class-based societies and authoritarian regimes. James Sweat never aspired to become a symbol. He would have preferred anonymity, just another pilot doing his duty without acclaim. Yet history imposed symbolism upon him. His Medal of Honor made him a public figure. His remarkable first mission made him a legend. His modest post-war life made him an example. Accepting these roles with humility became another form of service. When the History Channel invited him to help recreate his combat mission, Sweat could have refused. Instead, he took part wholeheartedly, offering precise details and ensuring accuracy because he believed younger generations should comprehend what their predecessors achieved. On a hillside in Northern California lies the resting place of Colonel James Elm Sweat. His gravestone bears his name, rank, dates, and Medal of Honor. It does not list his deeds. The stone is plain, dignified. Nearby lie other veterans, some who perished in battle, others who lived long lives. All served. The cemetery reflects equality in death, where all rest side by side without distinction. James Sweat would have valued that equality. He never sought privilege, never demanded recognition for his honors. The principles Sweat lived by were simple. Perform your work well, support your comrades, maintain your tools, accept responsibility, honor your obligations. These were working-class principles learned in workshops and applied equally in combat and commerce. They were practical and proven. 88 years after his birth in Seattle, 66 years after his 15 minutes over Guadalcanal, James Elm Sweat's life concluded. His story endures because it holds meaning, not for its rarity, but for its familiarity. Thousands of young Americans like him answered their nation's call, exceeded expectations, and returned home without asking for fame. They built post-war prosperity, raised families, strengthened communities. Their shared achievement was immense. Their personal humility exceptional. Together they defined an era. The ultimate lesson of James Sweat's life is clear. Ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results when preparation meets opportunity and courage. Sweat was no superhuman. He was trained, equipped, and driven. The system prepared him. Circumstance tested him. His character sustained him. The outcome was exceptional, but the process understandable. Any determined person with comparable training, resources, and integrity might have achieved the same. That was the true foundation of American success. Not superior individuals, but superior organization. Not natural-born warriors, but trained professionals properly equipped. Not inherited advantage, but cultivated skill. The formula proved consistent and enduring. It brought victory in World War II and continued shaping success in later challenges. James Elm Sweat passed away in 2009 as the last of the greatest generation slowly faded. His death marked the close of one man's story, but the endurance of the values he represented. Courage and modesty, competence and humility, service and citizenship. These ideals remain as vital now as in 1943. Technology advances, threats shift, challenges evolve. But the essential character that empowered Sweat's generation remains timeless. By honoring James Sweat's accomplishments, we pay tribute to an entire generation. By studying his life, we learn lessons for our own. By preserving his memory, we help future generations understand what their forebears achieved, and what principles sustained those victories. A working man became a hero. The hero returned to being a working man. The circle completed itself. That was the American ideal, the democratic spirit that set America apart from militarized nations. Service when called upon, humility forever, and honest work as the highest purpose. Colonel James Elm Sweat would not have wished for a grander tribute than this remembrance of his life and duty. He was, in the end, simply doing his job to the utmost of his ability. And that, as it turned out, was extraordinary.